Well, hi there. Welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan Biediger, and today I want to talk about a form of thinking that doesn't start with plans or concepts. It takes shape through touch, small movements, and the act of making. Before I get started, I want to say one quick thing. This is one of those ideas that's much easier to experience than it is to explain. So if it feels familiar before it sounds clear, that's exactly the point. There's a moment that sometimes happens at the bench, and it's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. You sit down with the intention to work on something. The pieces are there, the tools are there. The project is familiar enough that nothing about it should feel mysterious. And yet, there's a pause. Not frustration exactly, just a sense that whatever you thought you were going to do next just hasn't gelled yet. So you do something small. Maybe you dry fit a part you've already tested before. You rotate something slightly, not because you expect a revelation, but because your hands need something to do. Or you pick up a brush and run a quick pass of paint over an area you know isn't final, just to see how it looks in the light. And somewhere in that small, almost unimportant movement, something shifts. The piece shifts, or maybe you change. It's hard to say which. What's clear is that the idea you are waiting for doesn't happen before the movement. It appears through it. This is something miniature work makes impossible to ignore, because at small scale the results show up immediately. Every adjustment carries weight. A few millimeters change the balance of a scene. Maybe a slight shift in posture can alter the entire emotional register of a figure. There's no neutral movement. Everything seems to count. When you're stuck in your head, everything feels equally possible and equally unresolved. The field is too wide. There's no edge to push against. But the moment you handle the work, the field can narrow. Possibilities change. Some options disappear. Others suddenly become obvious. In the same way the hands narrow the field, they don't show you everything. They show you something specific. And the strange thing is, a lot of that knowing shows up before you can explain it. One of the difficulties in talking about miniature work is that so much of what matters never becomes fully verbal. You can describe techniques. You can explain sequences. You can even outline decision trees. But there's a layer underneath all of that, a kind of knowing that shows up reliably in practice and almost never survives translation into words. You see it most clearly when someone is asked to explain why something doesn't work. Maybe they'll pause, they'll look again, they'll gesture vaguely at the piece, and then they'll say something like, "It just feels off," or "It doesn't sit right," or "I can't tell you why, but it needs to move." In skilled work, that kind of knowing is not a fallback, it's foundational. What's often happening here is muscle memory. Not memory in the sense of recall, but procedural memory. Muscle memory is built through repetition and feedback. It's the body learning how much pressure to apply, how far to rotate, when to stop. It doesn't store instructions. It kind of stores adjustments. And once you've built that kind of procedural memory, the judgment starts to feel immediate. Like you just know, even when you can't explain it yet. This is what philosophers of practice sometimes call tacit knowledge, not as a mystical category, but as a practical one. It's knowledge that lives in doing rather than describing, knowledge that shows up as timing, pressure, restraint, and adjustment. Miniature work depends on this kind of knowledge constantly. You know how much force to use when trimming a part without measuring it. You know when a surface has enough variation without counting the brush strokes. None of those decisions are random. They're informed, they're disciplined, they're just not easily verbalized. In practice, it often looks almost boring from the outside, but it's the whole engine. You do something small, you look, you adjust. The adjustment isn't based on an abstract rule, it's based on recognition that builds over time across dozens or hundreds of similar moments. And eventually it becomes reliable enough that you trust it without needing to explain it. This is why it can feel strange, even uncomfortable, to be asked to articulate your process once you've internalized it. The explanation always feels thinner than the experience, but that doesn't mean the experience lacks structure. It means the structure lives somewhere other than language. A figure can tolerate only so much adjustment before its balance collapses. A base can carry only so much texture before it loses coherence. You feel limits through resistance, through visual overload, through the sudden sense that you've crossed a line you didn't know was there until you crossed it. That recognition often doesn't materialize as a neat thought. It shows up as a hesitation, a pause, a decision to stop. This is one of the reasons miniature work rewards repetition. Each repetition doesn't just reinforce technique, it refines judgment, it sharpens perception, it builds a sensitivity to small differences that matter disproportionately at small scale. Over time, the hands begin to know what the piece can tolerate, not because the hands are magical, but because they are the site where feedback is most immediate. When you move apart and the scene suddenly feels unstable, you don't need to analyze it to register the problem. The instability is perceptual. It's tangible. You correct it by moving again. You can see this most clearly at the moment when someone says, I didn't realize that's what it was until I moved it. That sentence contains the entire argument. The realization doesn't precede the movement, it follows it. And once you accept that sequence, the role of uncertainty shifts. Uncertainty stops being a sign that you're unprepared or unfocused. It becomes a sign that the work hasn't yet been asked the right question. And one of the ways the work asks that question is by getting the thinking out of your head and onto the bench. Once you start paying attention to what the hands are doing, another pattern becomes hard to ignore. The thinking doesn't just move into the hands, it can move out of your head altogether. It shows up in the object itself, in the way parts are arranged, in the way space is divided, in the way possibilities get narrowed or opened depending on what's physically in front of you. This is one of the reasons miniature work feels so different from purely internal forms of planning. You're not holding the entire problem in your mind at once. You're redistributing it across the bench. And because the work is right there in front of you, visible and persistent, it does some of the cognitive work for you. You don't have to remember every option you considered. The rejected ones are often literally off the table. You don't have to imagine how something might feel in space. You can see it, test it, rotate it, remove it. Architects build models not because they can't draw, but because models reveal spatial relationships that drawings sometimes can't fully resolve. Engineers prototype not because they lack equations, but because physical systems behave in ways that surprise even careful planning. In all of those cases, the object isn't a representation of the thought exactly. It's a participant in it. Miniatures operate in exactly that realm. When you place a figure on a base, you're not committing to a final decision. You're creating a temporary external structure that allows you to see relationships you maybe couldn't evaluate all the way internally. That structure holds the thinking steady long enough for the perception to catch up. This matters because human attention is limited. You can only hold so many variables in your mind at once. And miniature work, despite its scale, involves a surprising number of interacting factors. A pose can affect balance. Balance can affect mood. Mood affects surface treatment, and surface treatment affects narrative. Trying to resolve all of that mentally before acting can be inefficient, and sometimes it's just unrealistic. So the work itself becomes a kind of memory. It remembers where you've been. It records which paths you've tried. It shows you physically what's already been decided and what's still in flux. This is where the connection to mapping becomes especially clear. A map is not the territory, but it allows you to navigate the territory by externalizing relationships. It reduces cognitive load by stabilizing information outside the mind. A miniature scene does something similar. Once you've blocked in the main forms, you no longer have to imagine the overall composition. It's there, you can react to it. Once you've established the major value relationships, you don't have to keep recalculating mood. It's visible to you. The work holds those decisions so you can move on to the next layer. This is why progress at the bench often feels non-linear. You might spend an hour making changes that seem minor, even trivial, and then suddenly something clicks. The piece becomes legible in a way it wasn't before. That moment isn't magic. It's the accumulation of many small previous moments. Each small action externalized a bit more of the thinking. Eventually, that's enough structure outside your head that the remaining questions become answerable. One of the reasons thinking with your hands works so reliably is that it aligns with how perception operates. We tend to talk about seeing as if it were a neutral intake of information, followed by interpretation, as if the eye gathers data and then the mind decides what it means. But when you spend enough time looking closely, really looking, that sequence starts to feel backwards in practice sometimes. What usually comes first is not understanding but orientation. Before we know what we're looking at, we know whether it feels stable. Before we identify a story, we can register tension or calm. Before we interpret meaning, we sense whether the scene holds together. These judgments are fast, they're largely nonverbal, and they're deeply spatial. Miniature work makes this especially apparent because there's no room for those early signals to hide. At small scale, perceptual coherence either happens or it doesn't. You feel it immediately. This is why a miniature can feel off even when every individual component is competently executed. The issue isn't technique, it's orientation. Something about how the elements relate in space hasn't resolved yet. That unresolved feeling isn't an opinion, it's perceptual friction. This is also why certain adjustments feel disproportionately effective. A slight change in figure placement can suddenly calm the entire scene. A small shift in light direction can clarify hierarchy. An edge softened in the right place can give the eye somewhere to rest. Which brings us back to the hands. When you're at the bench and you respond to that uneasy feeling, when you move something because it doesn't sit right and not because you can justify it, you're responding to perception, not theory. That response is a form of thinking, even if it doesn't feel like one. It's thinking that happens at the speed of seeing. If you try to force meaning too early, you end up arguing with your own eye. You override the signals that would otherwise guide you. And this is one of the subtle traps that miniature artists can fall into sometimes, especially when they're thoughtful and expressive. You can explain your intentions, you can describe your concept, but if the perceptual structure isn't there yet, those explanations sometimes just don't land. Not for the viewer and often not for you. The work has to settle in first. That settling doesn't happen through explanation. It often happens through adjustment, through small changes that allow the eye to rest, to move, and return. And this is exactly what your hands are doing when you keep nudging a scene into place. You're helping the eye find where it can rest. This is where the idea of windows becomes useful. A window doesn't show you everything. It shows you just enough. It stabilizes the act of looking by limiting the field. It gives the eye a direction to move from. When a miniature scene works, it does something similar. It quietly answers the question, where am I standing? That question is almost never verbalized, but it's always present. Am I above the scene or level with it? Am I looking in, across, down, or through the scene? Am I a witness, a participant, or an outsider? Those positional cues are established spatially, not narratively necessarily. They're set by height, angle, distance, and framing. And once they're set, interpretation becomes possible. This is another reason thinking with your hands is so effective. Your hands are constantly adjusting these spatial cues, often without naming them. You lower a figure slightly. You bring an element closer to the edge. Maybe you reduce clutter near a focal point. Each move subtly repositions the viewer. The eye responds to that immediately. If the response feels right, you keep going. If it doesn't, you adjust again. This loop, act, see, adjust, mirrors how perception works. Trying to bypass that loop by deciding meaning first is like trying to read before your eyes have focused. Your hands are still thinking. There's a point where all of this, hands, perception, external thinking, begins to feel inseparable from scale itself. Not just miniature as a subject, but miniature as a condition. Because working small doesn't simply reduce size, it changes how decisions behave. At miniature scale, actions have consequences faster than they do at full scale. There's less room for adjustment, less space for ambiguity to linger. A single stroke can dominate a surface. A single object can overwhelm a scene. This compression is what makes miniature work demanding, but it's also what makes it such a powerful thinking environment. Every move counts, and because every move counts, tools start to matter in a very particular way. Tools aren't neutral. They don't simply allow you to execute an idea more efficiently. They shape what kinds of decisions are available to you in the first place. At small scale, switching tools isn't always just a technical adjustment. It can be a cognitive one. This is why people often find that they think better during certain stages of a build. The tool in their hand is asking clearer questions. When you're cutting or trimming, you're forced to decide where something ends. When you're painting, you're forced to decide how light behaves. When you're weathering, you're forced to decide what kind of time this object has lived through. Those are not abstract decisions, they're physical ones. And because the feedback is so fast, you notice immediately when you're not acting. And it's also why hesitation can feel amplified. When you delay action at small scale, the thinking doesn't continue in the background, it can stall. There's nothing new to respond to. That doesn't mean you need to be decisive all the time. It means that decisiveness becomes a physical process rather than a mental one. The object keeps you honest. That's part of what makes miniature work such a good training ground for judgment. The work either holds together or it doesn't, and you feel it quickly. This is also why we develop strong tool preferences. It isn't only comfort, it's cognitive fit. Certain tools help you think clearly at certain moments because they force the exact kind of decision the work needs next. If a piece feels conceptually vague, you might reach for a tool that forces commitment. If it feels visually noisy, you might pick something that demands restraint. This is thinking through selection. At miniature scale, that selection matters quickly and visibly. Another consequence of scale is that stopping becomes more significant. At full scale, you can often add without destabilizing the whole. At small scale, addition has a cost. Every new element competes for attention. Every new texture risks overwhelming the surface. Every new color can shift the balance. So stopping isn't just a practical decision, it's a conceptual one. It's the moment where you decide that the work has reached enough clarity to stand on its own. That decision doesn't always come from logic. It comes from a felt sense of equilibrium. The scene feels settled. The eye moves without resistance. Nothing demands immediate correction. That feeling is perceptual, physical, and learned. It's the accumulation of all the feedback the work has given you so far. And once you stop, you often understand the piece more clearly than you did while you were building it. Distance can sharpen recognition. Because the work is small, it can often be taken in all at once. You don't have to scan, you don't have to remember what's around the corner. Everything is there. That total visibility allows for a kind of global judgment that's harder to achieve in larger formats. You see relationships, you see priorities, you see what the piece actually values. And that retrospective clarity often feeds forward into the next project, not as a rule book, but as a shift in sensitivity. You don't always say, "Oh, I should do that again." You say, "Wow, I recognize that feeling now." That recognition lives in the hands. So when I'm talking about thinking with your hands in miniature work, I'm really talking about a system where scale, tools, perception, and action are tightly connected. You don't think, then make. You think by making. There's a moment in miniature work that doesn't get talked about much, partly because it doesn't look dramatic. Nothing is broken, nothing has failed. The piece isn't ruined or stuck in any obvious way, and yet nothing is moving forward. You sit down, look at the work, and feel a kind of quiet suspension. Not confusion exactly, more like a lack of traction. It's tempting to interpret that moment as a problem with motivation or confidence or clarity, to assume that something internal has gone missing. But if you look at it through the lens we've been building here, that moment reads differently. What's missing is feedback. The work in its current state isn't asking you a clear question yet. That doesn't mean you've reached a dead end. It means the system is waiting for another input. And input in miniature work is often physical. So here's a small practice I use when a project feels on hold. It's not a productivity trick. It's just a way to generate feedback again. What you can do is set a timer for 20 minutes. And for once, the goal is not progress. The goal is information. For the first 5 minutes, change one spatial relationship. Dry fit something and move it. Shift a figure a few millimeters. Tilt an object. Raise it, lower it. Nothing permanent. Just see what the scene does when the balance changes. In the next 5 minutes, make one value decision. Not detail, not color, just light and dark. Deepen a shadow. Brighten one plane. Give your eye a simpler structure to react to. In your next 5, test one surface idea. Maybe add a little texture. Or suggest a bit of wear. Something that answers the question, what kind of world is this part of? Then, in your last 5, resolve one edge, one place where the scene needs clarity. Sharpen it or soften it, but decide. You're telling the viewer's eye where to settle. Then stop, even if you want to keep going. And when the timer ends, ask one question. What became clearer? Not what should I do next, not whether it's good, just what changed in your perception of the piece. This is where the whole argument comes into focus. Thinking with your hands isn't about abandoning intention or drifting aimlessly through a project. It's about recognizing where intention actually forms. It forms in response to what the work gives back. The hands don't replace the mind, they extend it. They give thought somewhere to land. Miniature work is small, responsive, and quick to reveal vagueness. That's what makes this extension visible in a way larger formats often don't. You can tell when the work is giving you information and when it isn't. That sense comes from paying attention to how the work responds when you touch it. Over time, that attention builds confidence, not the kind that comes from certainty, but the kind that comes from familiarity. You don't need to know what the piece will become in order to begin. You only need to know how to listen once it starts responding. And the answers often don't come as sentences. You recognize them as balance, in resistance, in moments of clarity or unease. You feel it in your hands. So if there's one reframe to carry forward from this episode, it's this. When nothing is moving, it doesn't always mean something is wrong. Sometimes it just means the work is waiting for you to touch it again. So if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a fellow hobbyist, subscribe, follow, or simply take a little time to listen when you can. I appreciate every person who joins me here, and I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in hand, story waiting. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, nod obediently, and keep your story your own. Thanks for listening.